Well, welcome, Ipsa Dixit listeners. My name is John Paul Hicks. I'm your guest host this episode, and I'll be interviewing Brian Frye. Brian, how are you doing today?
Good, John Paul. It's great to talk to you.
Well, this is a lot of fun, and I know it's going to be a little bit of a unique episode in the sense that we get to interview, or I get to interview you, and we get to hear your thoughts on some things related to plagiarism and kind of how you got to those views. So I'd really like to start, just dive right in if that works for you.
Sure, absolutely. We'll make it a coronavirus special, as it were.
Perfect. Yeah, maybe we should give the listeners a little context on where we're recording this, kind of the times. We're in a voluntary quarantine right now. The date we're recording this is March 19th, 2020. And we're in the middle of spring break, and we've just been told that we're moving to all online classes. So anything to add to that?
No, nothing other than I'm looking forward to trying out a new modality for content delivery, as it were, in my law school classes. I guess we'll see how it works out.
Fantastic. Well, let's dive right in. I'd really like to start at your time you went to undergrad at Berkeley. Is that right?
Sure. Yep. UC Berkeley.
What was the decision to go there? I know you're from the area. Did you have any kind of underlying desire to go there?
Yeah, so I grew up in Santa Rosa, California, which is the county. Well, it's not the county seat, but it's like the largest town or largest city in Sonoma County, which is a couple counties north of San Francisco. And when I graduated from college, my father told me that I could go to any college I wanted to as long as it was UC Berkeley.
Well, it's a good thing you got in.
Yeah. I think that could have been generalized to anywhere in the UC system. Essentially, back in the early '90s, when I went to the UC, it was very inexpensive by comparison to other schools, especially for California residents. So it was largely a cost-saving measure. But it worked out great. It's a good school. I really enjoyed it. I was there for a little under 3 years, and I really had a good experience.
So you graduated in 2.5 years?
Yeah, 2.5 years. Yeah, I took a lot of summer classes, and you could take up to, I think it was 20 credits a semester maximum. And at the time, at least, I kind of looked at that as, well, if extra credits are free, then I may as well take them.
Sure. Well, that's very economical and fits right in with your dad's kind of instruction there as kind of a cost saving measure.
Yeah.
So what'd you study while you were there?
So I did a minor in film studies, which was a group major in comparative literature, rhetoric, English, etc. So it was like classes in a bunch of different departments, and basically anything that said film on it counted toward the major. And then I did a minor in philosophy as well. Okay.
And did you have any idea going in that is what you wanted to kind of do, or did you take an elective and find out, hey, this is kind of interesting, I have kind of a natural talent in this, I'd like to pursue this a little more?
Yeah, I mean, when I was younger, I kind of thought I would pursue more of a science background, but I got really into film when I was in high school. A good friend of mine in high school, Dan Martinico, went to this summer program called a California State Summer School for the Arts, where he took classes with a bunch of kind of interesting art filmmakers, including Valerie So, as I recall, among other people. Anyway, so he came back from that having made these videos that were kind of super weird art films. And when he showed them to me, my reaction was sort of like, oh my God, I didn't know you were allowed to do that, as it were. So, I went out and bought a bunch of stuff, including, most notably, I got copies of Sergei Eisenstein, the famous Russian director from the 20s and 30s. I got his 2 books translated into English, Film Form and Film Sense, where he sort of described his theories of film editing. But, it being the late 80s, that kind of very late 80s, that kind of stuff wasn't really available to rent really in Santa Rosa, or at least I didn't know where to go to get it. And so I had to kind of imagine what his movies would look like based on his descriptions of them.
Okay.
And then started making films, or well, mostly videos at that point, but then later I started making Super 8 films when I got to UC Berkeley as well.
Okay.
So I got really into that.
So you're kind of cultivating this interest in producing work, producing art, as it were, and that kind of started early on. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, kind of an interest that developed when I was in high school and kind of blossomed from there. So I started making films on film as soon as I got to UC Berkeley. They didn't really have a film production department. Well, they didn't period have a film production department at UC Berkeley at all. They had a couple cameras in a closet, but no one was real excited about students using them. So I ended up picking up most of my own stuff and getting a hold of surplus 16mm film and shooting some stuff. So I was sort of making movies on my own wherewithal while I was doing kind of academic film studies. And then when I graduated from Berkeley in December of '94, I didn't know what I was going to do next, and so I got really into experimental, the new American cinema, American experimental filmmaking, taking classes with like Ernie Gear, among other people, who was teaching an American avant-garde film class. And Kathy Garretts was sort of my main mentor. She was the experimental film programmer at Pacific Film Archive. So I sent out 2 applications, one to the master's/PhD program in cinema studies at NYU, and one to the MFA program in filmmaking at San Francisco Art Institute. And I just figured I'd get into whichever one accepted me. Turned out they both did, but the Art Institute accepted me first, and I was like more excited about that. So I went there immediately after graduating from Berkeley and started in January of '95, and kind of fully directed myself toward filmmaking at that point.
And that's in New York, is that right?
No, San Francisco Art Institute was in San Francisco. So NYU also accepted me. I ended up going there later, but ultimately dropping out my first time I went to NYU because I just wasn't interested in the field of study, it turned out.
Sure. Well, let's get back to that. Sorry, I messed up there. Let's go back to the Art Institute in San Francisco.
Yeah.
So you go immediately after graduating in December '94, right into Masters of Fine Arts program in San Francisco.
Yep.
And is that is it what you thought it would be? Was it kind of getting your creative juices flowing? Were you satisfied with what you were doing?
Oh yeah, I had a great time. I mean, art school is expensive, probably more expensive than it should have been, but I'd saved a lot of money in undergrad, graduating so quickly and living real cheap. So I kind of felt like it wasn't the end of the world. And it was very kind of freeform kind of program. I was probably a little young for it. I mean, I was 20 when I started my master's program. But the classes were a lot of fun. At that point in time, they had a lot of really interesting people who were either permanent faculty members in film or who were visiting from other places. So I got to take classes with a lot of people I was really interested in. People like filmmaker Martin Arnold, Guy Sherwin, Barbara Meader, Steve Anker, Ernie Keir, you name it, a bunch of really interesting people. George Kuchar, whose teaching assistant I was for many years, Larry Jordan, or Lawrence Jordan, he calls himself now, still actually around. Anyway, a bunch of really interesting people were teaching there. And so I really enjoyed the classes, got a lot out of them. And the program was really just geared to give you as much opportunity to make movies as possible. So, I mean, I just churned out a huge amount of film while I was there, just trying a bunch of different things and seeing what I found interesting, and sort of I had a real habit of learning about other film the way other filmmakers approached filmmaking and trying to imagine what they were doing and then recreate what their films without ever having seen them. And the results were always kind of interesting because it turned out that, the film I imagined rarely looked all that much like the film they actually made. But I guess in retrospect, it kind of plays into my my interest in plagiarism, right? So, I mean, the entire film practice was really a form of artistic plagiarism. And I think most art is really about plagiarism at the end of the day. It's about copying things that you love so much that you want to make them your own.
So you mentioned you had a lot of influences during your time at the Art Institute,
Mm-hmm.
and I just have a couple of questions about those.
Mm-hmm.
Did any of them are you still in touch with any of them today? Do you still keep in contact with any of them?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, so Steve Anker taught a lot of the classes I was really interested in, and also was the director of the San Francisco Cinematheque at the time. So he was the dean, I believe, of Cal Arts for a while. He's a professor there now, I think. So I've, talked to him occasionally. George Kuchar, unfortunately, passed away quite a few years ago. Lawrence Jordan is still around. I haven't talked to him in a while, but I'm sort of circuitously still in touch with him through Canyon Cinema, which he was involved with for many years. Martin Arnold I haven't talked to in a while, but I mean, like, I'm still in the same circles with all those people,
Sure.
and when it comes down to it, I mean, the experimental film community is relatively close knit, although global. But one thing it doesn't include a lot of is lawyers. So I'm basically the only lawyer that any experimental filmmakers know. So anytime there's a problem, that anyone has a problem, like a law related problem in that or question or anything in that world, they call me directly. Or if anyone has a problem and asks a friend, what do I do? They say, oh, call Brian. He's the person to talk to. So, I mean, probably once a week I get contacted by someone from the film world who's got a question or something like that.
I think I've heard you say before you have a thriving pro bono practice.
I do. It's amazing how easy it is to collect pro bono clients.
Sure. Okay, so while your time there, you met a lot of influential people. What are some of the kind of specific kind of lessons you learned, or techniques, or even thoughts about plagiarism, or anything kind of along those lines while you're creating all these films that you took from these influences? Is there a specific instance or kind of a specific theme that kind of stuck with you during this time that you kind of later took with you?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say like one big influence on me, both at Berkeley and then much more so when I was in art school, and then kind of developing in subsequent years. As I was working in the art world as a programmer, a writer, and an artist, was the Fluxus movement of the 1960s, and in particular, its kind of founder slash figurehead, George Maciunas, who was a Lithuanian artist and a very close friend of Jonas Mekas, who was the sadly recently departed founder and director of Anthology Film Archive. So Fluxus was an art movement, kind of a loosely knit art movement that was really about like kind of it was like conceptual art without the pretense. Right. So
Okay.
really about kind of trying to engage with the experience of the world and producing art as a byproduct of living in the world. And so, different artists interpreted that in a lot of different ways. Today, probably the best known Fluxus artist is Yoko Ono, but a lot of other artists were kind of tangentially affiliated. Warhol was close friends with a lot of Fluxus people. Namjoon Paik was affiliated with Fluxus. George Maciunas himself produced a lot of really interesting artwork. Ben Vaudier. I mean, there's just a ton of really interesting artists who were affiliated with that movement, and I think that kind of ethos really spoke to me, that kind of not taking yourself too seriously and not being too precious about what it is that you do, and just kind of enjoying the process of creating whatever it is you create. And I think increasingly what I'm really interested in doing is trying to see if and how I can turn legal scholarship into a form of art practice. And it really hit me, like my old friend from law school, Emily Bremer, observed the other day, that in her opinion, I was an artist whose medium was legal scholarship, and I'm really doing my best to take that to heart.
Sure. So not taking yourself too seriously and the legal profession don't seem to mix real well. It seems kind of like oil and water. So let's go before we take the jump to when you decided to go to law school.
Mm-hmm.
You finished film school in
Mm-hmm.
San Francisco.
Yep.
What's the next step? What was kind of on your radar there? What did you see as like the next thing?
Yeah, I mean, I spent the summer kind of hanging out in San Francisco, and then part of the summer anyway, and then immediately, I sort of as art school was winding up, I reapplied to NYU to the same graduate program, and so in the fall of '95, or sorry, in the fall of '97. I started a graduate program in cinema studies at NYU. So I moved to New York City, which was an interesting experience. You know, I was basically destitute and just going on loans and the
Sure.
couple bucks in my pocket. And so, yeah, I mentioned you this anecdote. It was sort of said a lot to me. Seeing like I arrived in New York, you know, flew in to New York and was taking the subway to the apartment on Roosevelt City that belonged to a friend of a friend who was going to let me stay there while I looked for my own place to live. And being relatively new to the city, although I visited several times, I plotted out my route without realizing that when I took the A train up into Manhattan, I was going to have to go through I was going to try to transfer, you know, to the Sixth Avenue line. And I didn't realize fully that there was a tunnel connecting the two stops. And I was traveling with like 2 suitcases containing everything I owned, which included several like very heavy movie cameras and reels of motion picture film, which I brought more of along with me
Sure.
than I did clothing, to be honest. So I was like walking through this tunnel, just dragging, like I could barely make it with these 2 massively heavy suitcases. And it was rush hour and people going back and forth everywhere. And I kind of had to stop for a minute and put them both down to catch my breath. And a fella in a suit was briskly walking down the tunnel, and he just picked up one of the suitcases and started walking along with me. And when we got to the subway at the other end, he just put it down and said, "Welcome to New York," and walked away, which was really kind of a cool like introduction to New York City and the way at least a certain kind of feel of the city sort of always had to me. Like, you know, people have in some ways are really distant, but in other ways can be really generous as well.
Sure. If you told me that story would have happened, I would have thought, without naming the city, I would have thought, oh, he's probably in Omaha, Nebraska, or somewhere in Middle America. But when you say that happened in New York, and it was a guy dressed up in a suit and kind of, I don't know. To me, that kind of shows me that no matter who you are, what position you're in, you're still able to help someone else in need, which is some of the things I think you've kind of taken and not only done as a teacher, but also kind of helped your students with, especially with one of the plagiarism projects I'm working on currently. But did that have an impact on your life, or is that just kind of a funny kind of one-off story?
Well, I mean, I think it stuck with me because it was such an interesting moment and an experience that I wasn't expecting, but that also really said something to me about the feeling of living in a city like New York, which is such a kind of transnational kind of node of activity. I mean, like you said, like in some ways we think of that kind of generosity as being a very kind of middle America, like you said, Omaha, Nebraska, which I kind of liked. As you know, I was just there, and I know that you have family in Omaha. When Omaha,
Yeah, my wife's
yeah,
from there.
yeah, absolutely lovely place. Love Omaha. It was a wonderful place to visit. Incredible food and very nice people. But I kind of feel like the difference is like, at least in my experience, like under those circumstances, somebody's going to help you, but they're also going to like be super friendly and be talking to you and ask you questions and blah, 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 blah. Whereas a guy in New York didn't say a word to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
He didn't even
Mm-hmm.
ask if I needed help or anything. He just did it and then left. And that was it. Right. And that was what made it really New York to me.
Sure.
You know?
Sure. Not the kind of, hey, do you need help? But hey, I'm going to help you.
Yeah.
We're doing this together. We're in this together.
Yeah.
Kind of the community that you kind of stepped into or walked into.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you're in the program. how long is this program in the Master of Fine Arts program in New York?
Well, that was a regular master's program that kind of segued into a PhD program, but I only made it about a year and a half, and I realized that it was just not a field of study that I was interested in pursuing. So this was the mid '90s, and cinema studies was really dominated by a kind of Marxist Lacanian take on what you were doing when you did film studies, and it just wasn't my thing, right? I didn't really find that particular approach very appealing, and I was much more interested in film practice and film history than I was in this kind of theorizing project. There was an anecdote that kind of struck me. So, the main reason I chose that program was because Annette Michelson was teaching there, and she was someone I really admired, who was a critic and historian of the American experimental film. And I was really bluntly less interested in most of the other people in the program, although a lot of them were very interesting scholars, and I totally respect them. It just wasn't why I was going. Anyway, Annette Michelson was teaching a seminar class on American experimental film, maybe 15 students or something in the class. And on the first day of the class, she sort of went around the room and asked everyone why they were taking that particular seminar. And all the people in the class kept, saying like how interested they were in American experimental filmmaking. And I was sitting there thinking to myself, I've been to every single relevant film program in New York City in the last 6 months or whatever it was. And the one thing I haven't seen at any of those programs is you, right? And those are the only places you're going to see this kind of stuff. So this is a kind of abiding interest that doesn't seem to be reflected in your actual daily practice. And what was interesting about it, what those people meant was they were interested in reading about the films and what certain kind of theorists had to say about them. They weren't really so interested in actually watching the movies. And for me, I was, in the program in the first place because I was interested in film practice and in the experience of movies, and not so much the experience of reading critical theory and Lacanian analysis. And so that for me was it was a kind of a wake up moment where I realized this probably isn't a great fit for me and my interests. So I left the program and ended up just running like a week. I ran a weekly film series focused on experimental and amateur film in New York City called the Robert Beck Memorial Cinema with my friend Bradley Eros for several years, making movies, programming stuff, showing stuff at various places, and then writing for a range of different magazines, including Film Comment, Cineasts, the original online version of the New Republic, as well as other venues for a while, before eventually going to law school in 2002.
So 2002. So that was you kind of part ways with the program in 99, 2000. Is that about right?
Yeah, I think I dropped out of the program in like December of 98, roughly.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And then work kind of some odd jobs here and there, kind of passion projects, it sounds like.
Yeah, I worked mostly as like kind of a part-time film projectionist at Anthology. And then also I briefly had like a PR position, like selling videotapes at Kino International, which is a film distributor. I also worked at the Filmmakers Co-op as like a film program, like a film processor, as it were, like, basically dealing with like shipping and that kind of stuff at the Filmmakers Co-op.
We were just kind of segueing from the film program, master's program you were in, to the shift to kind of working, doing some odd jobs, to going into the legal profession and law school, starting there. How does that happen? How does someone go from make that leap?
Yeah, I mean, so it was kind of accidental. It's a bit of a weird, embarrassing story, but actually my girlfriend at the time had been talking about going to law school for a long time. And so I thought I was doing her a big favor when I went out and bought a bunch of LSAT practice books as a present. It's like, we're going to do it. You're going to study and go to law school. And she was notably unenthusiastic about the project. But it just so turned out that, like, I was, as I started doing the studying, and I went out and looked at the Harvard like summer reading lists for prospective law students and got a bunch of the books and read them. And I was like, this could actually be kind of interesting. So by, the long and the short of it is I, took the LSAT, did reasonably well, and was like, hey, why not? Law school seems like it could be good. And so I went, started, and just said I was going to go to Washington and Lee Law School. And basically it was because I didn't have any money. I didn't know why I was going to law school. And I just figured I'd go to the best school I got into that didn't cost anything. And that turned out to be Washington and Lee. And I was actually standing in line waiting to waiting to register when I got a phone call from Georgetown, and it was the admissions office saying, hey, you said you didn't come to Georgetown because we didn't offer you a scholarship. If we gave you a scholarship, would you come? And so I stepped out of line, walked to the dean's office and said, sayonara, I'm off to Washington, D.C., going to Georgetown now. And so I was actually sitting at so I went to stay with some family friends, my mom's college roommate and her husband who lived in D.C., again, while I was looking for an apartment. And it just so happened that the husband was the business editor of the Washington Post. So I told him this story about what had happened. He said, oh, I'm working on a story about, like economics and higher education. Do you mind if I use this anecdote? And I was like, yeah, I guess, no problem. And so, can I use your name? I was like, man, no skin off my back, buddy. Be my guest,
Sure.
Got it. So like 3 weeks later, front page of the business section of the Washington Post, the lead is Brian Frye was standing in line to the lead when he gets a call from Georgetown saying, if we have a scholarship for you, you have an hour to decide. So, this was like 2002, and, that law school was different back then. Admissions was different back then. And that was kind of something that wasn't done, and certainly wasn't something that people talked about. And so they were not very happy with me.
Washington Lee.
Well, Washington
Sure.
Lee kind of was able to deal with it. The people at Georgetown were not thrilled to find themselves on the front page of the local newspaper, looking a little predatory. Yeah, so that kind of was a funny moment. These days, of course, students bargain over, quote unquote scholarships. I call them discounts, but, students bargain over that kind of stuff all the time. But, in early 2000s, people were much more cagey, and, it was a little gauche to sort of talk about that kind of stuff. So that was a funny moment. And then, after I finished my first year at Georgetown, my girlfriend at the time was still living in New York. And I told her that I would put in for a transfer to move back up there, not knowing whether or not that was like something realistic. And, was living in New York for the summer, working and doing, little odd related law jobs, and ended up getting a yes from NYU to transfer. So I did my second and third year of law school at NYU.
Well, let's back up just a little bit. So that first year, my experience is that first year is just absolutely terrible.
Uh-huh.
Like it's awful. Like you're learning how to think, you're learning how to juggle things. You were in a new city. Could you just describe kind of not only that process, but while you were in the classes, what you found interesting, what you found kind of crossed over from your previous experiences, what you were good at, what you hated? What was kind of that first year like for you?
Yeah, well, I loved legal writing. That was like probably my best experience kind of class-wise. And for me, that was really just a wonderful opportunity to kind of practice expressing myself in a new format. And I really like the clarity of legal writing. I mean, coming from a humanities background, for better or for worse, a lot of that writing is almost ostentatiously abstruse. And I really like the way that legal writing encourages a certain kind of directness and clarity that I found really refreshing. In terms of class content, there was a legal philosophy class that was taught by one of the Jesuit professors at Georgetown. I really enjoyed that class a lot. He was really interested in Thomas Aquinas, and so we spent a lot of time talking about natural law and this kind of thing. I found that really interesting. I think the best experience though was I had kind of a telling one for me too. It's like I, had civil procedure my first semester, which I managed to equip myself in a most incredibly mediocre fashion. So it's kind of ironic. I later became a civil procedure professor, but for all you students out there, I actually got a B plus in civil procedure, which is basically the equivalent of a C at Georgetown. So, there you have it, right?
Well, Professor Frye, we know grades don't matter.
That's right. That's right. But the thing I really liked about it is that the professor who taught that class, Naomi, who's an absolutely delightful, wonderful person, even though she was going through a really difficult time that year, she asked me, kind of this very mediocre student in her class, to be her research assistant on a paper she was working on film theory in relation to legal scholarship. And I was both like really flattered and, so it just made me feel really good about myself in that moment. And later, she was the person who was the first person who really said to me, of course you're going to be a law professor, which had never occurred to me until she said it. So, that was a pretty important kind of person in my life who made a really big impact on me.
Well, that has to be hugely impactful for someone to say, hey, this is your identity, and now you're going to grow into that identity.
Yeah.
Like I see the finish line, and I'm going to help you get there. Like that's huge, right?
Yeah. Well, it was also kind of seeing a possibility that had never occurred to me, right? And I think that that's true for a lot of people, especially people who don't have lawyers in their background, or certainly don't have academia in their personal background. It's really hard to see yourself becoming a legal scholar, or even to conceptualize that as a possibility. And so having someone kind of make that seem real to me was huge and made a really big difference, because it just didn't even occur to me that I could do that. And, and it was funny too, because I assumed as a law student that all of my classmates were out there, reading law review articles in their leisure time and thinking about ideas for law review, like ideas for papers, and kind of like approaching law in that way. And it wasn't until many years later as a law professor that I realized that, well, maybe not all my classmates were doing that.
Well, I can tell you as a current 3L that not too much has changed over the last 20 years, but neither here nor there. So were you able to ever follow up and ask her, like, hey, why did you choose me? Did you see something in me? Was there something that kind of made you think, hey, this is the guy?
Well, sure. So Naomi and I are friends now. Weird, and that's a weird thing too. It's like to go from being a student to being a peer. I still feel like a student in some ways, although I know on another level that I should be thinking of myself more as a peer. But I think the reality is that she's one of those really rare, hopefully not that rare, but to some degrees rare professors who really just sees people for who they are and is really paying attention to her students. And so I think that she had a similar response to a lot of other people, and I know that she's offered encouragement to other people who she saw potential, not just for legal academia, but for other things as well.
Okay. So the first year, you finish that up, sounds like pretty good. And then get some kind of odd jobs the summer in New York, end up transferring to NYU. Mm-hmm. How did you finish out those last 2 years? Did you kind of take, how did you decide which classes you wanted to take?
So at NYU, I took nothing but legal history classes because that's what I was really interested in. So I took every legal history class they offered. That was usually 2 or 3 a semester. I did have a job at Sullivan and Cromwell, so I took like securities regulation and corporations because I felt like I was kind of need that for the purpose of my actual job. But I never took any of like the regular law classes. So like evidence, no. Trust and estates, no. Tax, No. None of those.
Wow.
Yeah, not a single one. In fact, I have the dubious distinction of currently never having really taken any of the classes that I teach. So I didn't take a single intellectual property related class at NYU, although that's what I teach now. And I didn't really even take professional responsibility. I took like a special seminar class for professional responsibility for criminal defense lawyers.
Okay.
Which I had no
Right.
intention of being a criminal defense lawyer, but it just looked like an interesting class. So we didn't learn any of the normal PR related stuff. It was much more kind of focused on the kinds of responsibility issues that would confront a criminal attorney, rather than the kinds that would you'd normally be thinking about on the MPRE and whatnot. So yeah, but it worked out fine. And the reality is, I think that, I mean, knock on wood, maybe not having had those classes as a student made me a little bit more open to sort of idiosyncratic approaches to thinking about and teaching in the areas in which I teach in right now.
So not taking those classes, did you ever feel like, hey, I might not be able to, there's might be a deficiency here, or I might not perform as well as on the MPRE, or is there any kind of stories there?
So John Paul, I like to tell students, I'm happy to offer advice about what to do. That advice is usually based on my having totally fucked it up myself.
Sure.
So when I graduated from law school, I had lined up 2 clerkships, one in the Washington State Supreme Court and one in the Ninth Circuit. And so I figured, I did the bar exam and everything and passed the bar in New York. And I figured, well, I'm not going to bother filling out all the forms and jumping through all the hoops to actually join the bar, including take the MPRE, because, what the hell, right? I mean, I don't need to be a member of the bar while I'm clerking. So that's just a waste of time and energy. I'll do it when I'm done, before I start.
Sure.
So I was very proud of myself, this kind of very, efficient approach to this decision. I arrived in Washington State, and the secretary, Sylvia Campbell, says to me, "Oh, Brian, so, what state are you a member of the bar in?" I'm like, "Well, I'm not a member of any bar because I don't need to be, and why bother doing that before I actually have to go into practice?" He says, "Well, that's really a shame because they'd pay you so much more money if you were a member of the bar." It's like, oh, no. So word to the wise, join the bar because it will increase your pay scale, even if you're clerking. So then I had to go and take the MPRE because I hadn't done before. I signed myself up for the MPRE, started doing this clerking job, and I was really enjoying it. Really had a fun time clerking and researching and writing stuff for the judge. And one afternoon, I think it was a Friday morning, I was like, I signed up for the MPRE. When was that? It turned out it was the next day in Seattle. Right? So I had to print off like an MPRE study guide and take a bus up to Seattle from Olympia. And so I spent about an hour and a half in a bar the night before the MPRE, like reading through this study guide. That was studying for the MPRE. Not a course of study I'd particularly recommend, but I guess it worked out.
Crushed it.
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
I don't know about crushed it. I mean, I think the smart money says that any score you get higher than the passing score on the bar or the MPRE is just evidence that you spent too much time studying.
Yeah, there's no room on the scorecard for comments, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Well, so fascinating. Graduate law school, get through the clerkship. Was there any aspirations to be a career clerk? Did you want to kind of continue down that road, or your previous experience kind of wanted to lead you towards being a law professor?
Well, no. So I really enjoyed clerking. I never really considered like a career doing that. I actually wrote my first published law review article while I was clerking on the Ninth Circuit for Judge Kleinfeld. And it was like a kind of historical piece about United States v. Miller, really 1930s Second Amendment case. And but I already had a job lined up at Sullivan and Cromwell doing litigation there. So that was sort of like the plan: go back to New York, work at Sullivan and Cromwell for a little while. And while I was at Sullivan, that first law review article I wrote ended up getting cited by Justice Scalia in his opinion in Heller. And so that was like a big to-do, ta-da-da. And I mean, honestly, it was probably helpful in terms of landing a professor job. At least the article
Hmm.
got some attention. But so I was at Sullivan for about 2.5 years, and then I quit and took a job as initially a kind of a contract position teaching legal writing at Hofstra University Law School. And then after that first semester teaching legal writing, they needed someone to teach civil procedure. So they transitioned me into a kind of podium filler, doctrinal teaching job. So I
Okay.
taught civil procedure, and then I also taught in nonprofit organizations and art law seminar class. So I was there for a couple of years teaching, and then got the job at University of Kentucky.
Any kind of issues or any kind of anxieties about going into a doctrinal professorship role after after that amount of time between law school and kind of going back, or was it like, hey, this is just one more
Yeah,
thing?
I mean, honestly, it was like there was a lot going on at that moment, and I just kind of didn't have a choice. And I think it's one of those things, it's real sink or swim. I mean, I didn't find out I was going to be teaching civil procedure until the end of the summer. And it was like, time to get started, right? So I just, I was like, well, I haven't really thought about a lot of this stuff kind of programmatically since I was in law school many years ago. And I actually didn't do that well in civil procedure, which I found kind of hilarious. But really it was just about like, okay, let's figure out what I need to teach and get started and see what I can do. And, I'm sure it was pretty rough that first couple of years, but you get your feet wet and you figure it out. And, you get better at it with time, and it was a weird moment. It was like I had recently met Penny Lane, and we were actually working on a feature film together at that time while I was teaching at Hofstra. So it was kind of just a really busy time in my life, and I had a lot of stuff going on. So, I just kind of flew by the seat of my pants and made it happen.
Sure. And how many years were you at Hofstra before Kentucky
About
came
two
calling?
and a half years. So that first semester teaching legal writing, and then I had a year teaching doctrinal classes as I went on the job market, and then they hired me on for a second year teaching the same classes again while I was on the job market. So I finished up to Hofstra, finished that year, and then moved to Kentucky that following summer.
It taught Civ Pro, is that right?
Yeah, civil procedure. So I was a full year class at Hofstra, and I taught the same civil procedure when I started at Kentucky. Only transitioned to teaching professional responsibility a couple of years ago.
Okay. And then, so while you're at Kentucky, is this kind of where you find your groove in the IP world? And
Yeah. So I didn't start teaching intellectual property till I came to the University of Kentucky, because the person who previously had been teaching it was retiring. Um, but so I wasn't really writing in the area, and I hadn't taught in the area at all when I started this job. But it's definitely been the mainstay for my scholarship so far. I mean, I write in a lot of different areas, but kind of a lot of it centers around intellectual property and especially copyright related issues. Although I'm really interested in moving into doing some more trademark related work as well.
well, and that was in when was your first year at University of Kentucky?
Oh man, I believe it was 2012.
Okay. So about 8 years
Yeah,
ago.
yeah.
Well, fantastic. Is there anything else? Any other funny stories or anything you want to tell here?
Oh, too many funny stories, but many of them probably should not be immortalized.
Sure. Hey.
On a podcast, I gotta,
Fair enough.
even a troll has to watch himself every once in a while.
Yeah. No, that's right. Well, I tell you what, any advice for anyone considering law school or going into academia, or what would you tell? I guess if you could go back and talk to yourself 1L year or that summer while you were preparing for the bar, what would you tell yourself based on your experiences?
Oh, wow. I mean, myself, I have no idea. Right. I mean, I think that like my choices have always been a little idiosyncratic. And I think, I have the benefit of a lot of privilege that allowed me to make choices that I think might not be available to other people. But I think for law students, the main thing I tell people who are considering law school is, for better or for worse, you really, really, really need to spend some time practicing the LSAT because it's a very learnable test. And I think, as I've seen working in an admissions committee and whatnot, I think a lot of students just, don't prioritize that as much as would ultimately, sadly, really benefit them. I'm not defending the test or the test as a way of evaluating law students, but it's the reality. And, you're really doing yourself a disservice if you don't focus on it. As a law student, I think, just ignoring the weird social dynamics of law school and focusing on yourself and focusing on learning, I think that's really the key. If you come out of law school or as you spend your time in law school focused on learning things and on the ideas that are being discussed and that you're sort of being asked to engage with in class, I think you'll get a lot more out of it than if you focus on competing and if you focus on the kind of internal social dynamics of the class. For me, it was helpful that I was a little older when I started, and I think that's true for a lot of older students, but I think anyone can sort of, if they put their mind to it, really kind of focus on themselves and on their own project rather than on what's happening around them. When it comes to academia, I mean, I think it would be great if more law students saw academia as a possibility. Unfortunately, it is very status conscious. So, for people who don't go to Harvard, Yale, or Stanford, or NYU, or Columbia, or whatever, it can be a lot harder to get a teaching job. That said, I actually think that the market for legal academia has changed, for better or worse, to some degree, by virtue of an increased focus on actual scholarly productivity as opposed to potential scholarly productivity. So, like they like to say, there's the LSAT is the best predictor of your first year grades in law school, but it's not as good as predictor as your actual first year grades in law school.
Sure.
Likewise, there's a lot of proxies that schools historically used for, potential productivity as a legal scholar, but none of those proxies are as good as a measure as actual productivity as a legal scholar. So I think a lot of people who don't have the kind of traditional law professor pedigree are starting to find some real success by simply showing schools that they're actually already capable of being good scholars by virtue of the actual scholarship that they've produced. So that's hard for people who don't have the institutional support, which a lot of schools don't necessarily provide. But I think that there are other resources out there, and there's a lot of people who are happy to help and offer advice. So I think for a lot of people who have their kind of heart set on legal academia, it really can be a possibility for people for whom it might not have been in previous years. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of time. It takes, a lot of planning. But I think it is possible. And it's really all about showing the people who are looking to hire that you have what it takes to be a legal scholar. And there is a democratizing effect, I think, to some degree, to the increasing focus on the actual work as opposed to just the pedigree and the potential.
Well, hey, couldn't have said it better myself. That's kind of all I have. Thanks so much. It was great getting to know you a little bit better, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to come on here and guest host.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, John Paul. It was really fun, and I look forward to posting this episode.
Sounds good. Talk to you later.